In this video, we're going to wrap up our investigation of the tetrapods. Let's first talk about foraging. The transition from an aquatic to a terrestrial habitat provided a lot of new foraging opportunities for tetrapods. Remember the invertebrate lineages that we had talked about previously, many of the arthropods, had already invaded the terrestrial environment. Additionally, the gastropods had preceded the invasion of tetrapods on land. So this gave them a lot of food sources that were already in existence and available. All adult amphibians and most reptiles, excluding some of the birds, are carnivores. Additionally, most frog larvae are primarily herbivorous, but as far as adults, most of them are carnivores. Adult frogs eat a huge variety of prey. They're very much generalists in their foragers because they're sit-and-wait predators, and they have to basically eat anything that comes by. And so they've got a couple of adaptations that increases the chance that they will be able to forage successfully if something comes close enough. First, they have a sticky anteriorly attached tongue that they can throw out really quickly. And what this does is it can temporarily immobilize the prey, and usually instead of bringing the prey to the mouth with the tongue, they then follow body-wise, and they basically do a mouth plant on the prey. So they're using the tongue to basically hold the prey down. The other characteristic that increases the chance that whatever comes by they'll be able to eat is most frogs have very large mouths. And so this just increases the chance that whatever comes by, they will be able to fit in their mouth. Mammals and birds tend to vary quite a bit in their diets. So they can be carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores. And they have to eat a lot because remember, this is the group that are endotherms. So they require a lot more food due to this higher metabolic rate. Most tetrapods have relatively simple, what are called homodont teeth, meaning that all of the teeth are kind of peg-like and very similar to each other, kind of like seen in this crocodilian here. Amphibians actually have very few and relatively small, simple teeth. However, when you talk about mammals, mammals have a huge diversity of teeth. They have what are called heterodont teeth, meaning there are different teeth classes and they differ quite a bit from each other and in their function. So incisors are the front teeth that are kind of used for nipping off small pieces of food. Canines are the sharp kind of fang-like structures that are better for piercing and ripping flesh and large pieces of fruit. But then the premolars and the molars are the flat teeth that are typically associated with mastication and chewing of the food before it's swallowed. Birds and turtles lack teeth entirely. But that doesn't mean they can't give you a good bite. Most of them still have very sharp cutting bills. And bill shape varies quite a bit with the diet. So if you look at something like this raven here, that's a pretty generalist bill for a generalist diet. On the other hand, you look at this cardinal, that's a big seed cracking bill. That broad base serves as the attachment for some very powerful muscles, and so they can produce a lot of bite force associated with that bill, in the same way that a parrot can because of its broad base. A meat-tearing bill, like seen in this eagle here, is typical of raptors. Some birds use their bills to spear fish. Others use tiny, thin bills to probe deep into soil for invertebrates. Pelicans have these dip nets with large pouches for collecting a fish, kind of like a net. And flamingos have these very elaborate tongues that they use to filter water that's trapped in their bill. What they do is they filter out the zooplankton that's living in that water. Tetrapods have muscular tongues, which are used to capture or collect food. So for some examples, we've already talked about the sticky frog tongues. Woodpecker tongues are fascinating. They're very long. They actually wrap around the outside of the skull and actually enter into the nose. But if you pull a woodpecker's tongue out a little bit, you can feel the very tip of it. It feels kind of like sandpaper, and sometimes it has these hooks on it, and that's so that they can probe into dead wood and grab things like insects and insect larvae. Hummingbirds have tubular tongues for foraging on nectar, so quite a bit of diversity in tongue morphology. Another example, the tongues of giraffes are very muscular and they are very agile and can actually wrap around branches to strip leaves off of branches, so they kind of act like hands almost. Except for the mammals. Mammals are the exception to this, but most tetrapods don't masticate their food before swallowing. And so that means they have to rely on chemical digestion. Or, in the case of birds and crocodilians, they actually do masticate their food, but deeper into their digestive tract in a special stomach chamber called the gizzard. The intestinal tract varies depending on diet. So in carnivores, it's relatively simple, straight tract because meat is pretty easy to digest and there's fast absorption of that. Herbivores have a much more complex digestive tract. So first, they oftentimes have food storage structures called crops where they can temporarily store food. It's kind of in an assembly line waiting to pass through. And then they have chambers where they store mutualistic bacteria that have the ability to actually break down cellulose. And this is a slow process, and so they usually have special chambers in their stomach or large intestines and these extensions called ceca, where they can kind of slow this process down and digest food with the help of their mutualistic bacteria to get this product from the cellulose. All tetrapods have a closed double circulatory system. The complexity of the heart varies, however, so there's a 3-chambered heart in most where there's 2 atria and a single ventricle. So this is seen in amphibians and most of the reptiles. There is some partial ventricle wall separation in the ventricle, and that allows a little bit of limitation to the mixing of the blood. Because remember, this is a double circulatory system, and how it would work in a 3-chambered heart is the ventricles would be pumping the blood first through the lungs, then returning oxygenated blood into the left atrium. That then has to dump back into the ventricle that is not only receiving blood from the pulmonary system, but it's also receiving blood from the systemic system. So unless you have some ability to keep these from mixing, you're mixing oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and so that's not the most efficient system. A 4-chambered heart provides an elegant solution to this. So now we have both 2 atria and 2 ventricles, so that when blood returns to the left atrium, it dumps into just the left ventricle before it then is pumped out to the systemic system, delivering oxygen-rich blood that hasn't had to mix with the oxygen-depleted venous blood. So it's much more efficient transport, and this is what's seen in crocodilians, birds, and mammals. Birds and mammals actually have quite a bit larger hearts. It allows them to have even more efficient transport. And they need this because, remember, they're the endotherms that have the higher metabolism. They also have faster heartbeats and higher blood pressure. As far as respiration goes, terrestrial environment provides some opportunities because oxygen concentrations in air are much greater than that in water. The problem, however, is you have to keep your respiratory surfaces moist. So most juvenile amphibians don't have to worry about this because they have gills and they're still living in water. They have to resorb this tissue during metamorphosis, though. Others live in moist enough habitats or live in water where they can come in and out of water enough that they can get by with cutaneous respiration if they're relatively thin, a lot of surface area, so that fits the caecilians, salamanders like this here, and some frogs. But most tetrapods have lungs to internalize their respiratory system, and remember, these lungs are homologous to the swim bladders in the lungfish. We see a general trend in increasing the complexity, the vascularization, and the surface area of lungs in the tetrapod lineages. So amphibians have relatively simple sac-like lungs, not a lot of surface area there. Most reptiles have increased the surface area and the vascularization for more efficient absorption of oxygen and getting rid of CO2. But birds within the reptiles have made it even more complex. So they have actually relatively dense lungs, but they're packed with these microscopic air capillaries, so there's lots of surface area there. Mammals increase their surface area by breaking the tissue up into a lot of small little grape-like sacs called alveoli. So how do animals actually breathe, these tetrapods? What they have to do is have some way of effectively moving air in and out of their bodies. And amphibians do this by first drawing down the floor of their mouth. Air enters the mouth, and then they basically close their mouth to swallow this air into the lungs themselves, not into the stomach, but into the lungs. And then contractions of the body forces stale air out to start a new cycle. Their negative pressure or vacuum is typically used to suck air into the lungs. How most reptiles do this is they have rib muscles that expand the rib cage, creating this negative pressure. Then they use other rib muscles to force out the stale air. Crocodilians and mammals have a diaphragm muscle that when it contracts, it increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. And so this again creates a vacuum to draw air in. And then relaxation of the diaphragm forces that stale air out. But in all these cases, these organisms don't completely empty their lungs. So every time there's an inhalation and exhalation, there's mixing of fresh and stale air. So you're not getting complete access to all the oxygen that may be available in the atmosphere. Birds have figured out a way around that. In birds, they have the most efficient respiratory system of tetrapods. They have a one-way flow of air, and this maximizes the oxygen concentration that is available in whatever environment that they're breathing. So what occurs is there's one breath of air has to go through 2 cycles of inhalation and exhalation to go through the entire system. So if you look down here, inspiration 1, the first time they inhale, the air, that cohort of air goes into these posterior air sacs, and it doesn't really even do much in the lung. Then when they exhale for the first time, over here, then these air sacs deplete and the air moves into the lungs. So it's 100% clean air going into the lungs because the next stage, inspiration 2, there's another batch of air going through what we just did over here, but our original batch of air now is leaving the lungs and moving into the anterior air sacs just for storage. Now it is oxygen depleted with lots of CO2 such that on expiration 2, it leaves the anterior air sacs and it leaves through the nostrils of the bird. So see, we have this nice one-way circuit of air so that stale air is never mixing with the fresh air. The inhalations are due to muscles that expand the ribs, similar to other reptiles, but it also moves the sternum down to create a little bit more vacuum. And then exhalation is simply due to the relaxation of these muscles. As far as nitrogenous waste and water balance, again, terrestrial environment provides some unique challenges. If you're an amphibian that has access to a lot of water, you can just release relatively dilute urine and use a lot of water to wash that out of you. More terrestrial species of amphibians use urea instead of ammonia, and they can concentrate this and save water and use less water to get rid of this nitrogenous waste. The reptiles are even better. They mix their nitrogenous waste into what's called uric acid, and they mix this uric acid then into the feces to make this pasty material that really uses minimal water loss. And that's including how birds do it. Mammals, it's kind of variable. Mammals use varying amounts of water to produce more dilute or concentrated urine. Oftentimes, the same species can vary their urine concentration based upon their hydration. So most tetrapods are still ectothermic and generally poikilothermic, as we've talked about throughout the semester. And in temperate zones, if it gets too cold, they sometimes go into hibernation. But if the environment provides them enough access to thermal environments that is what they want their body to be, they can practice behavioral homeothermy, where they can bask in sunny areas, say in the early morning and late evening. And then as it gets cold at night, they go to fossorial habitats that are better insulated so they don't lose heat. And then during the heat of the day, they can move to shade of trees or under rocks so that they don't overheat. So they can, even though they are ectothermic, they can maintain some homeothermy by this behavior. But as I mentioned, birds and mammals are endothermic. They have the capabilities of having much higher metabolism. And so most of them are homeothermic. And they have evolved anatomical and behavioral mechanisms to help maintain or shed heat as needed to keep them at their thermal optimum until they stay relatively consistent in their temperature. Some of the things they do to stay warm, they have amazing insulating coverings that we've already talked about, so feathers in birds and hair in mammals, and also varying thickness layers of fat depending on their thermal needs. The closer you get to the tropics, the less fat you have, and the closer you get to the polar regions, the more fat birds and mammals tend to have. Also, just during breathing through the nose, they have lots of highly vascularized nasal cavities that reduce the loss of heat exhaling, and it warms air as they inhale so that it doesn't send too much cold air to the core body. When birds and mammals get really cold, they shiver, and this activation of large muscles increases body heat generation. And then also they practice some behavioral homeothermy as well, moving to appropriate microhabitats to reduce body heat loss so they don't get too cold. So getting out of the wind, for example, snow burrows, things like that. If they get too hot, there are certain things they can do too. One is use evaporative cooling. So sweating, in some mammals at least, is what they can do there by having evaporative cooling. Again, not all mammals have sweat glands throughout their body. So panting, like you see in dogs, they're using that as the evaporative surface for evaporative cooling. And then bathing, getting in water just throughout over your entire body can also provide some evaporative cooling. But then behaviorally, you can also just move to more appropriate microhabitats such as shady areas or windy areas to help you dissipate unwanted heat. Okay, what about reproduction? There's not a lot of asexual reproduction in tetrapods. There are some lizards for which we know only females, and so they do reproduce parthenogenetically. As far as sexual reproduction, all tetrapods are dioecious. They typically have paired gonads, so a pair of testes or a pair of ovaries. Birds are an interesting exception to this in that females only have one functional ovary. And remember, a lot of adaptations anatomically that birds have is to reduce weight, and this may also explain why they've lost one of their ovaries. As far as fertilization patterns, amphibians, as far as the aquatic amphibians at least, they tend to have external fertilization where males shed sperm over eggs that have been laid by females. They usually are in a copulatory embrace when the female does release the eggs and the male sheds sperm on them, but it is external fertilization in the water. Caecilians do show copulation with internal fertilization, however, and terrestrial salamanders, males put their sperm in spermatophores, these sperm packs. They put these on the ground and then the female picks them up for internal fertilization in the terrestrial environment. Amniotes, though, are again more adapted to terrestrial environments, so they have to show copulation behavior with internal fertilization. Males in most tetrapods do have a phallic structure penis. The key exception to that is birds. In birds, it's just cloaca to cloacal contact where sperm is transferred in copulation. Most tetrapods show pretty strict breeding seasonality, so they only breed in seasons in which they're most likely to have reproductive success. And during the non-breeding season, you typically see atrophy of the reproductive structures. You don't want to have to spend a lot of nutrients and energy to keep those things going if you're not going to use them year-round. Oftentimes, the breeding season is triggered by either temperature or circadian rhythm, or in some cases, rainfall in tropical species. Amphibian breeding is very dependent on weather. Frogs, for example, will tend to breed during a certain time of year, but rainfall events or certain temperatures, certain humidity levels, low wind conditions, these are all things that can increase the probability that you'll hear frogs calling on a certain night. Most temperate zone birds breed only in the spring and summer when food resources for feeding their young are at their peak, so insect abundance typically is what they feed their young. And mammals also tend to time their reproduction to maximize their offspring survival, and that's typically linked to whatever food that they eat when it's most available. Tetrapods show the typical situation where females are often highly selective of the males in which they mate. So males oftentimes have to evolve either intrasexually selected competitive traits like large body size or weapons, antlers, spurs, things like that, to directly battle with other males, or to indirectly battle with other males through things like sperm competition. So larger testes, the production of more sperm if you're in competition with other males to fertilize a female's eggs. But then also males oftentimes evolve exaggerated intersexually selected traits that are designed to convince a female to mate with you and not other individuals, to convince a female of your quality as being the superior individual genetically or physically. So this typically involves something like energetic courtship displays, so that if you're sick or you don't have good genes, you couldn't dance that well or produce complex, loud vocalizations, seen like here in this sage grouse. Oftentimes there are colorful traits that are indicating whether an individual is healthy or not. So bright feather patterns are important in most breeding birds and allow females to judge the winners versus the losers. Most tetrapods don't have pair bonds, and they mate multiple times, and there are no long-term association between males and females. But pair bonds, including polygamy and monogamy, are not uncommon in tetrapods. And in some groups, for example birds, there is a very dominant pair bond that's common, monogamy. And monogamy exists in most birds because of the necessity of biparental care, which we'll talk about later. They're deuterostomes. They show radial holoblastic cleavage ancestrally, but some lineages do show larger yolkier eggs, and so there's more meriblastic cleavage in those situations. And then in viviparous mammals, there's some big-time deviations as far as cleavage pattern. Now, amphibians, for the most part, lay their eggs in water, or at least some very moist environment, and then there's external fertilization and subsequent development in this water. Because if the eggs dry out, then they can't continue development because they can't exchange gases anymore, so they can't get their oxygen. So most amphibians have to go to water to reproduce. Now, there are some species of amphibians that show some extreme adaptations to get past this need for water. In some cases, there's brooding of young in the mouth, so they're still kind of kept in a moist environment, but not a pond. Mouth or vocal sacs, or sometimes even the stomach, where the parent will stop feeding for a time period so they don't digest their own young. Sometimes the developing eggs will develop on the back and be covered by skin to help keep them wet and from drying out. Terrestrial salamanders will lay eggs in moist terrestrial sites, and then the juveniles hatch directly into an adult-like form, so there is no larval development in that situation. And they can develop slowly enough and get enough oxygen as long as the moisture in that area and humidity stays high. And then some of the fossorial caecilians, because they're in moist soil, can reproduce there, but they reproduce viviparously. So they retain their young as they develop and actually provide nutrition to their developing young. Most of the aquatic larval traits are lost during metamorphosis. So for example, the gills and a tail that's used for locomotion. How long this larval period lasts in frogs can vary. So it can be just a few days in desert-dwelling toads because they've evolved this very rapid development because they are typically laid in ephemeral water sources that may only last a few days and dry up, so you have to develop quickly. And the opposite extreme of that are bullfrogs. Bullfrogs can take 1 or more years to develop from a larval to an adult form, and so they go through very slow metamorphosis, and they don't have to speed that up because they live in permanent aquatic environments. But now let's talk about what makes amniotes very different from the amphibians. Amniotes have what is called an amniotic or cladoic egg. And this was a key innovation in the evolution of this group, and it's what has really allowed amniotes to be so successful in drier habitats. So if you look inside of an amniotic egg, it has several membrane-bound structures that allow these organisms to develop independent of other outside sources of water. First of all, there's an amnion. The amnion surrounds the embryo and provides its own little pool of embryonic fluid. Another membrane is the allantois, and this is connected to the embryo, and it allows for the sequestration and storage of metabolic waste to get those nitrogenous wastes away from the developing embryo, because those are toxic materials. But they can't really leave the egg, so they just kind of pack them away in a safe place. But this structure is also highly vascularized, and the external part of it connects to the egg shell, and it can actually be used as a gas exchange structure. in addition to the other membrane that's lining the shell, the chorion, which is highly vascularized and used for gas exchange. The size of the egg oftentimes is decided by the amount of yolk that it has, and the yolk is stored in a yolk sac. So this is basically what is storing the nutrients that the embryo needs for development, and how long it can stay in there in large part is due to how much food is provided in the yolk sac. And then on the outside is a shell, and the shell can either be leathery, as it is in most reptiles, or more of a hard calcium-based shell we see in birds. And this provides a lot of protection for the egg and reduces dehydration as well. The only thing that kind of goes in and out of the egg through the shell are gases, so getting rid of CO2 and uptake of oxygen. But ironically, that's what limits where cladoic eggs can develop. They can develop pretty much anywhere in the terrestrial environment, but they can't develop in water because there's not enough oxygen that can get in through the eggshell. They have some oxygen absorption issues. So aquatic amniotes, like crocodilians, aquatic turtles, have to return to land to lay their eggs. They can't lay them in the water, which is ironic because the amphibians have to lay their eggs in water typically. Most of the reptiles are oviparous, but ovoviviparity and viviparity has evolved over 100 times in different reptilian lineages. Given that flexibility in the evolution of this, it's surprising that birds don't fit in with that. All birds are oviparous. Ovoviviparity and viviparity has never evolved in birds, and part of that, there's debate on why that's the case, but it's probably due to the fact that birds have incredibly high metabolism, and adult birds run hot. I mean, they generally go from about 104 to 112 degrees Fahrenheit core body temperature, and that's just too hot for most developing embryos. Most mammals are viviparous. The exception to that is oviparity that is seen in the monotremes, so the duck-billed platypus and the echidnas. They lay these leathery shells that when they hatch, the young feed on milk secreted on the mother's belly fur. They don't actually even have nipples, so they just have these glandular secretions in which milk is secreted where the young feed. Viviparity is seen in the remaining mammals, and it's seen in two forms. They're the marsupials or pouched mammals like kangaroos and opossums. Here the embryo will begin development in the uterus, but there's only a weak or indirect placental connection, so gestation is pretty brief, measured just in days to weeks. So the young are actually born really early and in what we call an altricial state, a very underdeveloped state. All they can basically do is slowly crawl and make their way to the pouch, and once inside the pouch, they attach to a nipple, and this is where they feed and remain for the majority of their development. They could stay many months in this situation. Now, one benefit of this type of reproduction is a single female can have multiple young developing at the same time, but at different stages of development. So here we have an embryo that's been fertilized, but it's in stasis, waiting for the completion of this individual to finish feeding in the pouch and continue its post-gestational development inside the pouch. But even once they leave the pouch, there's still some nursing of the young joey. Most mammals, however, are eutherians, meaning they're the placental mammals, and they have a more direct supply of nutrients delivered by the placenta from the mother to the developing young. Gestation is much longer in these typically, but it can still have a huge range. It can be as little as 20 days in some mice that just develop really quickly, to 200 days seen in deer. The developmental state of the young when they hatch depends in large part on the timing of gestation and how long it is. So if you're going to produce precocial young, like deer or wildebeest as shown here, that are pretty much ready to go as soon as they're born, they need to cook longer, basically. They need to be in the uterus longer for that longer developmental period and develop to a larger degree inside mom. However, if you're born as an altricial young, like we are, you're born relatively quickly and at an underdeveloped stage, and that's going to require lots and lots of parental care before you can reach the adult body form. There are lots of tetrapods that don't provide any parental care, but there are some that provide care or at least brood developing eggs. So examples of reptilian parental care is seen in dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds. All of these build nests, or did build nests. They provide protection of young in the nest while they're in the nest and also once they leave the nest. And in these lineages, care can be provided by males, females, or in some cases is biparental. So in hummingbirds, for example, shown here, the females do all of the care. In some shorebirds, males do all of the care. Of the reptiles, birds show by far the most extensive parental care behaviors. Most birds build very elaborate nests, and eggs have to be incubated, and they have to be maintained at a relatively consistent temperature for development to proceed successfully. Once they hatch, they develop very rapidly, and this basically requires biparental care and social monogamy. That's why these two things are linked. If your offspring are developing really quickly, it's going to take two of you going out and finding enough food to keep them fed, or they're going to starve to death during development. And so this cooperation is basically what leads to the importance of social monogamy, this pair bonding that allows them to increase the chance that they're going to be reproductively successful in taking care of their young. Mammals typically do show extensive parental care too, but in this case the care is typically uniparental and it's usually maternal care, and this is primarily because of the fact that only the females can lactate. Lifespan varies, so in amphibians and reptiles 5 to 10 or more years appears pretty common in some. Some birds live for about that same time period, but quite a few of them do live longer. So the smaller birds can be in the 10-year range. But once you get into some of the larger birds like the Laysan albatross, there's one that's lived for over 65 years. Some of the large turtles may live up to 150 years, and there's a general pattern that we've seen in some other lineages that those that live in colder areas tend to have slower maturation rates and developmental rates, and that tends to also translate into longer lifespans. Mammal lifespans are highly variable, so if you talk about a rodent, they have very quick generation times. Remember we talked about 20 days gestation period, and then they may only live for a few years, while larger mammals could live for 20 or more years. Some of the whales, like bowhead whales, have been estimated to live over 200 years. As far as defenses, many of them have the typical cryptic coloration that we've seen in other lineages. Aposematic coloration, including aposematic threat displays and even threat sounds, are oftentimes associated with chemical defenses as well. So the more typical poison dart frogs is a good example of aposematic coloration. Coral snakes would fit that too. Skunks would fit that. But as far as like an aposematic threat display and sound, think about rattlesnakes. The rattle itself is a warning, is an aposematic auditory threat. Wolves have a display associated with raising fur up on their backs and showing their teeth bared against their typically darker colored lips. So those are also threat displays. Physical defenses can be either passive or active. So in a lot of cases, they have protective epidermal shells or spines. So think about hedgehogs or porcupines. Frogs can inflate their bodies basically to make it where a snake just physically can't get them into their mouth. That's one of their defenses. But then there are also more active defenses, so using claws and teeth to go more on the offensive when attacked. Living socially provides some defense benefits as well. So if you're living in a group like a flock of flamingos shown here, there's better detection of any approaching predator, so you're going to see them sooner and farther away. If a predator does attack, there can be some group movements, coordinated group movements that oftentimes make it confusing to a predator to be able to kind of focus in on one individual and successfully attack them. And even if a predator does kill somebody in your group, if you're in a big group, you're benefiting from the dilution effect. Your per capita chance of being killed is pretty low. And social aggregations are pretty common. So we see this in the breeding assemblages of frogs. And then group living oftentimes is due to the necessity to share the limiting habitat. So snakes sometimes will come together in hibernacula, share crevice habitats just because they're limited. Same thing for cliff nesting birds like these shown here. This is a relatively safe habitat. There aren't any other resources though that are worth protecting. and so they all pack into this area and can lay nests right next to each other, basically. When you're in a group, sometimes cooperation of the group members can actually increase the group's foraging success to everybody's benefit. So this could include herding of prey, or some, like you see here with these American white pelicans. This coordinated dipping allows them to kind of corral the fish and increase the likelihood that all individuals are going to catch some fish. Wolves and other large predatory mammals like lions, by hunting together, they can sometimes capture larger prey items than a single individual would have been able to successfully do. And so that also benefits everybody in the group. Maybe not equally, maybe dominant individuals get more food than the others, but at least you're not going to starve in that situation. Sometimes these groups, extended family groups, by cooperating in a group like this and increasing the survival and reproduction of a family member, you're benefiting what is called your indirect fitness. Remember, fitness is a measure of how many genes you pass on to the future generations. But because family members share the same genes that you do, for the most part, if you help to increase their reproductive success or survival, it's indirectly helping you. So ground squirrels will warn each other about potential predator attacks. That may help save the life of many close relatives and benefit the individual giving the warning. We also talked about cooperative breeding in fish. This is also very commonly seen in some tetrapods, where helpers are non-breeding individuals that are helping oftentimes their mom and or their dad raise future generations of siblings. And so if they can help mom and dad pull off more siblings than they would have been able to do by themselves, they're also benefiting from a fitness point of view. There are lots of symbiotic relationships seen in tetrapods. Just to name a few, if you look at grazing mammals, they'll oftentimes feed together and benefit from the group dynamics that we talked about previously by increasing predator detection. One of the coolest stories is honey guides and honey badgers, and even humans. Honey guides will make very distinct vocalizations when they find a beehive, and they'll go looking for a honey badger or a human because they can't physically rip open the cavity to get to that honey and the wax that's a resource there. And so by recruiting a honey badger or a human to do the dirty work for them, they benefit, and they have also benefited the badger or the human by showing them the location of this potential resource. And the honey guides, what they get out of it is not as much eating honey, but they eat a lot of wax. So they have special digestive tracts for dealing with wax digestion. There are also a lot of parasitic relationships. Vampire bats feeding on the blood of other mammals. This bird here feeding off of this giraffe is an oxpecker. Sometimes oxpeckers may fit more under the mutualism situation, where they're maybe taking ectoparasites off of the mammals that they're foraging on, but studies have indicated that more often than not, what they're doing is they're actually pecking wounds, these bloody wounds on the mammals, and then feeding off of that bloody tissue. So that would make it a parasitic relationship. Some birds are what we call brood parasites, and this is a bizarre situation where they can lay their eggs into the nests of other individuals, oftentimes even other species, and force those individuals to raise their offspring. And so that's another form of parasitism. Finally, let's talk about some habitat use and environmental impact examples dealing with tetrapods. Invasive species are a big time problem for a lot of tetrapods. People like to introduce different tetrapod species into areas that they don't belong. So native amphibians in North America have really suffered from invasive cane toads and xenopus species. Not just North America, but this has been a particular problem in Australia. In North America, one of the biggest issues now with native frog populations is the spread of this fungus called chytrid fungus, and it causes these deadly skin infections. One of the worst invasive species in the U.S. and throughout the world really are feral cats. Just in the United States, feral cats kill billions, and it's not an exaggeration, billions of native amphibians, small mammals, snakes, lizards, and birds every year. Every year. I'm fine with cats, but if you have a cat, keep it inside, because outdoor cats are horrible. Not just the feral cats, but just outdoor cats in general are really devastating to native wildlife. Feral cats have been linked in some way or the other to the extinction of at least 33 tetrapod species in historic times. A friend of mine, Pete Mara, published this book, Cat Wars, and I highly recommend it. He's a good scientist, and he shows you just how bad cats outside can be. Historically, a big problem associated with tetrapod populations is overhunting. Overhunting for food or overexploitation for other things like pet trade or other products like, just think of whale bones being used for a variety of things. Classic example of overhunting was the passenger pigeon. It clearly drove the passenger pigeon to extinction when there were unbelievable numbers of these things living in the southeastern part of the United States, and over just a few decades they became extinct because of overhunting. Same thing almost happened to the American bison. Just a few individuals were survived, and they're making a comeback now. A lot of tropical bird species are endangered due to lack of habitat, and that's a key issue we've talked about for a lot of endangered species in general, but also because they're very pretty, they're wanted in the pet trade oftentimes, particularly parrots. Whaling has had a significant decrease in whale populations, and even though whaling is banned in some areas, there are still some countries that do practice whaling, and this is a problem for some of these long-lived species that have very slow maturation rates and also low reproductive rates. It's just not, you're not going to build these populations back up overnight. Climate change is resulting in the alteration of temperatures and rainfall patterns throughout terrestrial environments. And so this is altering the distribution of terrestrial habitats and the quality of these habitats. And we've already talked about how habitat loss, just in general to urbanization, has been a problem for many animals. All of this uncertainty is going to disrupt survival and breeding patterns in virtually all tetrapods. Amphibian population declines are particularly troubling. About a third to a half of all species of amphibians worldwide are threatened with extinction, and over 140 species have gone extinct since 1900. This is due to loss of wetlands, degradation of habitat quality, pollution, disruptions of breeding phenology, invasive species, chytrid fungus, increased ultraviolet radiation, and how it affects their skin, so lots of problems. And we talked in a few lectures back about how increased ocean temperatures affect marine resources. And a lot of tetrapods rely on these marine resources. So rockhopper penguins are showing declines due to changes in their fish populations that they require for food. And marine mammal breeding success is also oftentimes affected by changes in prey availability. So there are these cascade effects. And I'm sure most of you have heard of some of the tragic situations associated with species like polar bears that rely on sea ice during part of the year, and the loss of this habitat is resulting in some pretty steep population declines and shifts of habitat use in those species. And lastly, I just want to drive home the point that we've been talking about animals this semester, but humans are animals. We belong to the great ape clade. Our most closest relatives are the common chimpanzees and bonobos. At that cluster, those two species together are our sister species. And our lineage, the humans' lineages, diverged from chimps starting about 6 to 7 million years ago. And we have lots of fossil evidence of some of the transitions in different lineages of hominids. So there's evidence of bipedal locomotion associated with skeletal changes and even footprints dating to about 3.5 to 4 million years ago. Signs of very, very simple tool use dating to about 2.5 million years ago. And then the origin of species in the genus Homo, there were several species in the genus Homo, date to about 2 million years ago. And these generally are associated with changes in leg and arm lengths relative to the torso, and also some major changes as far as cranium size and brain size. But modern humans, our species, Homo sapiens, date only to about 200 to 300,000 years ago. So we're definitely newcomers to the block. So reviewing this second part of the tetrapod survey, we talked about some of the foraging adaptations that tetrapods have, and these vary by diet and also among lineages or groups. So there can be different levels of complexity of the digestive system, oftentimes linked to whether they're herbivores or carnivores. Many of them have teeth. Most of them have homodont teeth, but they're heterodont teeth with different dental formulas, different combinations of incisors and canines and premolars and molars in mammals. But then turtles and birds lack teeth entirely, but they have different bill shapes for different diets. All tetrapods have a double circulatory system with either a 3 or 4 chambered heart. 3-chambered heart has maybe some potential mixing of oxygen deoxygenated blood. And so a 4-chambered heart is more efficient, but it's seen only in the crocodilians, birds, and mammals. Lungs predominate in these terrestrial tetrapods, but gills and cutaneous respiration is some that can stay in water-moist environments. Lung complexity varies, relatively simple in amphibians, and then showing increasing in complexity through reptiles with different ways of making it complex in birds versus mammals. And then we talked about the one-way system of flow that prevents the mixing of stale and fresh air. Birds have evolved that the other lineages have that problem. Talked a little bit about the excretion and water use, and how if you have access to a lot of water, you can produce more dilute nitrogenous waste, but those more adapted to dry environments can produce uric acid, and that's a much more water efficient way of getting rid of nitrogenous waste. We talked about endothermic and ectothermic lineages and the mechanisms of maintaining homeothermy, or at least partial homeothermy, in both. Endothermic, it's easier to do so because they can also just internally generate their heat and are not reliant just on external factors. But there's some limited potential for homeothermy in some of the ectothermic tetrapods. They're all dioecious. Internal fertilization predominates, again, because if you're restricted to the terrestrial environment, that's what you need. But some of the aquatic forms can show shedding of sperm on eggs in the water. We talked a little bit about the sexual selection patterns and mating patterns seen in different tetrapods. They're all deuterostomes, and they show ovo and ovoviviparous and viviparity, but this varies in different lineages. So, for example, all birds are oviparous, and most tetrapods just in general show oviparity. We talked about the significance of the evolution of the amniotic egg and how this really freed amniotes from requiring water during the reproductive phase, but it also had the ironic consequence of amniotes that are aquatic have to leave the water to lay egg or have viviparity. And viviparity is the key reproductive strategy in mammals, but there's even variations in viviparity in mammals. So know the difference between a pouched marsupial mammal and a eutherian placental mammal. We also talked about the fact that most of them don't show parental care, but parental care isn't really that rare, and in some cases, like birds, biparental care is generally the rule, and why that's linked to their high metabolism, fast growth rates, and it leads to biparental care being related to social monogamy. They have highly variable lifespans and defensive mechanisms. Many of them show high social systems. There are lots of symbiotic relationships. We just covered a few. And we talked about some of the habitat loss problems and problems with invasive species and climate change issues that a lot of different tetrapods face. Those are topics of lots of biological studies. And finally, I just wanted to close by making sure that you understand that humans are animals. Otherwise, how are we able to put all these other animals in a phylogenetic tree, but humans, where would we fit? Well, obviously we fit on the branch with all of the other great apes.